We're here with Grant Begley and the F-14. He's going to give us some history as well as some details on the plane.
I am Grant Begley, Navy captain, retired, former Navy Top Gun, thousands of fighter flight hours, hundreds of carrier landings. I have flown in combat, and I've had the great opportunity and experience of leading, managing, and contributing to the F-14 in the service of the nation. The F-14, in its 32 years of operational service, served superbly. Not measured so much in the ability or the number of aircraft that it shot down, but absolutely in the number of conflicts it prevented. There are few things as exhilarating as being fired upon in combat. The F-14 in its 32-year career saw combat in the Gulf area twice, the Gulf War of '91, and then the current involvement in Bosnia, in Lebanon, also in the Gulf of Libya with the Line of Death. The F-14 has been in harm's way in every engagement over 32 years until its retirement in September of 2006. I am here to tell you that there are a few things as exhilarating as being fired upon in hostility, and the F-14 was a superb aircraft in protecting its aviators as well as the carrier battle group. In one particular instant, as the F-14 and myself were in a threat environment, that neighboring nation did not appreciate our presence. The F-14's onboard avionics and computers were able to detect not only that we were being monitored by a threat radar, but also the radar had picked up my aircraft as a particular target. And in fact, a missile had been designated to destroy my aircraft. The onboard systems were able to inform me that missile launch was imminent, and in fact, inform me where to expect the missile to be launched from. With that cueing, I looked in the direction of the threat to see what appeared to be an Apollo-sized missile leaving the ground from a range of nearly 15 miles away, and knowing that missile had my name, my aircraft's name, on it. The aircraft was able to continue monitoring that missile, which I also was able to visually track very carefully as it continued to climb not toward my aircraft, but absolutely up to a much higher atmospheric level. This particular missile's flight profile was to climb high above my aircraft and then come down onto the aircraft. With that threat environment, watching the missile go to high altitude, on course, rockets still burning, and starting to tilt over to approach the aircraft, the F-14, with its great engines, with its high airspeed, and with its defensive systems, I was able to dump the nose of the aircraft, dive to the deck, take evasive measures, fly away to be here for this presentation today. The F-14 performed magnificently. The F-14 has one of the world's most powerful air-to-air radars. Initially equipped with the AWG-9 radar and then upgraded to the APG-79, the F-14 radar had the ability to look out very far, still classified, launch weapons and engage targets beyond 100 miles, that's unclassified. But what's interesting to know with this aircraft, given the large nose cone, which in fact covers the radar, down here is a bubble area. Now, what this aircraft does not have is the television camera system installed. With the television camera system, this bubble would come off, there would be a flat screen here, and you can imagine there would be a lens. The F-14 had the ability, through the radar interceptor officer in the back, to detect targets by radar at long range, lock those targets up very specifically, and then if the rules of engagement for hostile fire required a visual identification, to be able to see the target that you intend to destroy before you launch a missile, the aircraft then could automatically cue this television camera system to look at long range, to allow the aircrew in the cockpit to see the target that had been acquired by the radar, visually identify it through the television camera system, which has great magnification capability, and then make the determination whether to engage that target with lethal force and understand with clarity whether the target they were engaging was in fact a foe before the engagement. During a normal mission, the F-14 would be taken to the catapult. The aircraft would be strapped in the catapult, and within the coordination of the aircrew in the aircraft and the ground crew on the carrier flight deck that would launch the aircraft, upon signal, the F-14 would then be launched, catapulted into flight. Many individuals talk about and frame acceleration around today's current cars, the ability of a car to accelerate from 0 to 60 miles an hour, for example, in less than 4 seconds. The F-14 would accelerate from 0 to 165 miles an hour in 2.5 seconds. Quite a ride. You would be experiencing 4 to 5 lateral Gs. It would actually hurt to be launched off the front of the aircraft carrier. And oh, by the way, in that short launch period, as a pilot, you are along for the ride. There is not a lot you can do but hang on and hurt until you're off the front end of the aircraft carrier. But as soon as off the front of the aircraft carrier, your trusty GE 110 engines would kick in. You have 55,000 pounds of thrust, and you would completely and quickly accelerate to your flight speed and altitude to go to your mission station and prepare for either training or battle. As an interesting point of history, during Vietnam, naval aviation physiologists wanted to determine what the stressors on a naval aviator were in a combat environment. Those naval aviation physiologists went aboard aircraft carriers off the coast of Vietnam with their instrumentation, wired up the naval aviators to determine their heart rate, respiratory rate, blood pressure in the combat environment, and the purpose of the evaluation was to determine with expectation that the most stressful environment would be the combat hostile environment. To the aviation physiologist's surprise, what they found out was in fact the combat environment wasn't the most stressful on the naval aviators, but in fact it was the recovery of their aircraft back aboard the aircraft carrier, far exceeding the stress of combat. Naval aviators' heart rate went up, the blood pressure went up, respiratory rate went up, far exceeding what they were experiencing when they were being shot at with surface-to-air missiles and also surface-to-air gunnery. In the carrier landing environment, a pilot is required to bring, for example, the F-14 behind me in the most dynamic environment possible back aboard the aircraft carrier, where of the 5 things that could happen, only one of them is good. The 5 things that could happen are: you don't attempt to recover aboard the aircraft carrier, not good, the end of your naval career. You land too far left or right of the center line, not good, could be devastating, a mishap. You overshoot the landing area, also not good, or you end up far short of the landing area and you hit the back of the ship, also not good. The only thing good of the 5 elements is landing in a postage-size stamp area 100 feet by 25 feet with great precision, and that is the only desirable event in that carrier environment. As the ship is moving, it's pitching and rolling, as the winds blowing across the deck are variable, you as a fighter pilot, as a carrier pilot, must maintain your altitude, your airspeed, and your centerline approach with great precision as everything else is moving. One of the things that's absolutely exhilarating is the launch of the AIM-54 missile. As I'd indicated before, the missiles weigh 1,000 pounds apiece. And when one of those come off the aircraft, you can feel it in the aircraft. As the aircraft shudders, the missile comes off. The missile's engine then kicks in as the AIM-54 accelerates to Mach 5. The profile of the AIM-54 is not straight ahead of the aircraft, but the missile itself climbs to high altitude, over 80,000 feet, as it then cruises to its target area. In the event of that climb, the climb happens not far in front of the aircraft, and as an air crewman, it becomes quite exciting to see the going to the target area. The AIM-7 launches and the AIM-9 launches are a little bit more mundane. Those missiles come off the aircraft as you would expect a missile to, pretty much straight ahead, but then they do sharp and deliberate turns to their target area. The Vulcan cannon is actually exhilarating to shoot, as I mentioned before, at a round rate of 100 rounds a second. When you pull the trigger for the Vulcan cannon, the aircraft absolutely hums and buzzes. And as you're looking out of the front of the aircraft, the size of the rounds at 100 a second appear to almost be a chain, and you can walk those rounds onto a target of interest very easily. It is a two-seat aircraft, and the front seat is the pilot, and the back seat is the radar intercept officer. As mentioned before, the F-14 was designed around a weapon system, the AUG-9 and the AIM-54. It's the responsibility for the radar intercept officer to control the weapons and the operational environment and to assist the pilot during the aircraft's operation. As I move back here, you'll notice that the aircraft intake is one of two set far apart on either side of the nacelle. The F-14 has a unique characteristic that it has this large nacelle forward of the main airframe that tapers back into truly a flying body or flying wing position. This is the F-14's tailhook. One of the distinctive and absolutely required elements for the F-14 and other carrier aviation aircraft is the tailhook. The tailhook has to stop the aircraft in the very short arrested landing area on the back of the aircraft carrier. Naval aircraft carriers typically have 4 arresting lines on the back of the aircraft carrier. They're spaced about 50 feet apart from each other, starting with the number 1 wire, the closest to the back end of the aircraft carrier, and ending with the number 4 wire. Air crews typically target the number 2 to 3 wire, between those 2 wires, and a good aviator will trap and catch the number 3 wire. This tail hook, as the aircraft approaches the carrier, the pilot will lower the tail hook as one of the checklist items to make sure it is down for the carrier arrested landing. The tail hook itself has a pneumatic piston that lowers the tail hook and holds it down in place rather rigidly, but upon landing, the tail hook has the ability to flex and in fact can skip over the arresting wires. When a pilot lands on the carrier, the normal person would think that you reduce your power immediately, but contrary to that, as soon as you feel the touchdown, you go to full power with the expectation, pessimism, that the tailhook will not catch one of the arresting wires. A quick sea story, which being a naval pilot is necessary. One time I was flying with a junior pilot who was having difficulty getting aboard the aircraft carrier. I was chosen to fly in his back seat to help coach him along and to improve his carrier landing capability. The flight to the aircraft carrier was uneventful. The drop of the tail hook was uneventful. The approach to the aircraft carrier was uneventful. It was a night carrier landing. The night was moonless. There was a low cloud area. It was dark. The seas were pitching, and this young pilot had difficulty getting on board. I coached him numerous times with several approaches to the flight deck, and he had significant difficulty not only approaching the landing area, but in fact landing in the landing area, resulting from wave-offs from the signal officer. Finally, it was time for our last approach. We had enough fuel on board to do one final approach. His lineup was good, the approach to the carrier was good, he was on center line, the glide slope was good. It was looking like a picture-perfect landing. We touched down on the carrier deck and it looked like a perfect landing. But all of a sudden, something didn't seem quite right, and it wasn't. What he had done, as opposed to advancing the throttles to full military power, with the expectation that the hook would miss the landing wires, he reduced the power to idle. The aircraft became very quiet. And at that time, you could actually hear the tailhook skipping on the flight deck as we continued down the angle deck, and there was no tug on the wire. As I noticed, the aircraft was quiet. The landing signal officer noticed the aircraft power had been reduced. Simultaneously, the two of us called for power and then very quickly for burner as the aircraft failed to hook any of the arresting wires. We rolled off the angle deck under airspeed for flight just as these trusty turbojets were starting to kick into action. As we rolled off the angle deck, the aircraft sank significantly. I thought we were going to impact the water. As a response and impulsive, I grabbed for the lower ejection seat handle, tugged on it as I slapped at it, pulled it out halfway but lost my grip. Just as the GE 110 engines kicked in, the side of the aircraft carrier lit up as our afterburners kicked in. We tail-walked across the water with, according to the air crew and the flight deck members on the carrier, with a huge rooster tail behind us, and we waddled into flight. And that is one of my sea stories. While I'm at the back end of the F-14, let me point out a couple of specific items that might be of interest. As you notice, the engines are fairly far apart. This was a particular design criteria that enhanced and enabled the F-14 in the following ways. First of all, you have this large tunnel area between the two engines, and in this large tunnel area is where the AIM-54 missiles would be nestled up into the fuselage. This large tunnel area, and in fact the tapering of the aircraft from the cell all the way forward of the aircraft to back end, allowed the back part of the aircraft to be a lifting area while the aircraft was in flight, but also as the weapons were tucked into this tunnel area, actually folding and partly submerged into the aircraft. It reduced the amount of drag from those weapons in the wind stream, and that enabled the Air Force or the aircraft to have its high speed capability because there was low drag. Also, while I'm back here, let me mention that the engines being spaced as far apart as they are to enable the weapons to be in the tunnel area provided somewhat of a problem for the F-14. The F-14 was initially fitted with a TF-30 turbofan engine. Those engines were not the engines that were originally designed and expected to go in the aircraft. The first F-14s with the turbofan engines were underpowered, and those engines also had a tendency to stall. A stall of an engine, a jet engine, is a little different than the stall of your auto engine, but in some ways it's similar. The engine would stop performance. And so as a result of these engines being set far apart, if one engine stalled, as opposed to sucking air down that engine for the operation of the engine, that large face area to that engine would all of a sudden become a drag, a brake area. The good operating engine then would cause the aircraft to twist. And as a result, the aircraft could go into a flat spin very quickly, and the air crew would be unable to recover the aircraft from that flat spin unless they realized it within 2 seconds and recovered the aircraft. And typically, that was not doable. A number of F-14s were lost due to flat spins. As a result, the Navy decided it was time to put in a turbojet engine. The GE 110 engine was incorporated. The GE engine provided an additional 15,000 pounds of thrust, which you would expect would consume more fuel. But in fact, the GE engines provided greater fuel efficiency, greater thrust, and also enabled the F-14 to be launched from the carrier deck, not in afterburner, which was important from a operational capacity in the Navy. An F-14 on a carrier deck at night in afterburner could be seen up to 40 miles away. Not a good thing if you're trying to hide the carrier battle group. With the new GE engines, the F-14 could launch basic engine, not afterburner, therefore reducing the signature and the unintended exposure of the carrier battle group to ships in the area. And there's in fact radar antennas, receivers in these bubbles for the radar warning receiver in the aircraft. The aircraft has the ability to detect threat radars and threat missiles that have specific radar signals. These elements are important as a pilot flies in a hostile environment. He or she can determine what enemy threat radars are detecting the aircraft specifically, and then also if those radars go to another mode, for example, they target the aircraft, lock it up with their radar, it provides a different signal. And in fact, if that radar site then launches a missile at your aircraft, it provides an even different signal, which is very important for the aircrew to know. Something important to understand also is that the F-14, with its AWG-9 system and the AIM-54 missile, sends out very specific signals. And so as we have the ability to detect enemy threat radars and enemy threat missiles, the potential enemies also have the ability to detect our radar signals and also our missile signals. And the F-14 performed marvelously in its 32-year career in preventing hostilities. Potential enemies and threat environments knew when the F-14 was detecting their aircraft, knew when the F-14 had locked onto their aircraft, and knew when the F-14 was prepared to launch a missile. In the F-14's 32-year operational history, it only had 4 hostile engagements against enemy fighter aircraft. And those 4 hostile engagements resulted into a tally of F-14 Tomcat 4 wins, the enemy 0. I believe that the F-14's measure of success through its 32-year career is its ability to have eliminated hostilities, to have deterred the potential enemy from attacking our carrier battle group, and to deter our potential enemies from engaging the F-14. The F-14 was absolutely revered and feared by enemy opponents. I've had the opportunity to lock up potential enemy aircraft in hostile environments, be ready to squeeze the missile trigger, but then have those enemy aircraft turn and run. So the F-14's legacy truly is not in how many aircraft it destroyed, but how many engagements it prevented from ever happening. The aircraft itself is over 60 feet long, and with the wings swept forward in a full forward position, it has a wingspan of over 60 feet also. The aircraft, with no fuel on board, the dry weight is over 40,000 pounds, carrying a full complement of weapons, AIM-54s, AIM-7s, AIM-9s, and with the rounds for the M61 Vulcan cannon, the aircraft carries nearly 10,000 pounds of ordnance. To carry the ordnance, the aircraft needs a substantial amount of fuel and actually has an internal fuel capacity of 16,000 pounds and an external fuel capacity of 4,000 pounds for a total of 20,000 pounds of fuel. So with a dry weight of 40,000 pounds, the fuel capacity and the armament capacity, the maximum takeoff weight of the F-14 is over 70,000 pounds, in fact approaching 75,000 pounds. That large and heavy aircraft is capable of Mach 2 plus, has a climb rate of over 30,000 feet per minute, has an altitude of over 55,000 feet, with the engines on board that enable it to those speeds and those altitudes. The GE1 F-10 engine provides nearly 55,000 pounds of thrust. To put that in horsepower, it's 86,000 horsepower. For those of you that are NASCAR enthusiasts, you may realize that one NASCAR has about 860 horsepower. So when you strap an F-14 on your back in full afterburner, it is the equivalent of over 100 NASCARs strapped to your back. And the acceleration is exhilarating. To fly over 55,000 feet, to be able to see the stars in the full daylight, the sky is black, to be powered by those GE 110 engines is absolutely wonderful. The F-14 is a large aircraft to be in a carrier environment, but it was built around the weapon system that would enable it to go out and engage targets hundreds of miles away from the aircraft carrier. For the F-14 to also be able to perform as an air superiority fighter, it had to have large control surfaces that would enable the aircraft to be able to perform in a dogfight manner. As you look behind me here, you'll notice the stabilizer, the stab for the F-14. The stab for the F-14 in itself is almost as large as the wing of the former A-4 attack aircraft. The wing above my head is a variable sweep wing. The wing, swept fully forward at a 20-degree angle, allows the F-14 to take off and land at slower speeds, but at the same time automatically program in flight. It sweeps back as the aircraft's airspeed changes to a full aft sweep that then would enable the aircraft to fly in excess of Mach 2. What few folks don't realize, and in fact is not evident on this aircraft, there are glove vanes that are tucked into the forward leading edge of the nacelles of the engine. When the aircraft reaches Mach 1 and the wings behind me are beginning to program aft, the glove vanes up forward start sweeping out. And those glove vanes in themselves are very important to the aerodynamic stability of the F-14. They shift the aerodynamic pressure forward of the aircraft, reducing the loads on the stab behind me. The landing of an aircraft in the aircraft carrier environment is very harsh. The approach glide slope of an aircraft landing on an aircraft carrier is much steeper than at a typical airfield landing environment. That steep glide slope results in the aircraft impacting the flight deck of the aircraft carrier with much heavier impact, much greater loads than it would otherwise of landing at an airfield. To compound the situation, you never quite know whether the flight deck is going to be sinking as a result of a wave going away from the bottom side of the ship, or the flight deck could be rising. And therefore, if the flight deck is coming up and the aircraft is coming down at a very steep glide slope, it is absolutely a collision on the flight deck. The landing gear must sustain that collision. As a result, naval aircraft have to have heavy, beefy landing gear to sustain the great stress loads of the carrier environment. One particular flight that I had was in a field environment, not off the aircraft carrier. The aircraft was heavy with fuel, with weapons. It was a late night, early morning takeoff. I was given clearance to take off by the tower. No other aircraft in the field environment, 2 o'clock in the morning. As the aircraft was accelerating for takeoff, I was halfway down the field, ready to rotate into flight. The tower called me and said, abort my takeoff. With very little field length remaining on the takeoff runway, proceeded to apply brakes in an attempt to stop before running off the end of the runway. Accomplished that, didn't run off the end of the runway, a good thing. Pulled off the runway though, and the brakes on the aircraft felt a little mushy. The brakes had overheated as a result of decelerating the aircraft. It was traveling at 165 miles an hour. The gross weight was probably 65,000 pounds. These beefy landing gear and these beefy brakes were able to bring the aircraft to the stop I needed, But as I pulled off the aircraft runway, the brakes started failing. Hardly able to stop the aircraft. Was able, with failing brakes, to stop the aircraft, called the emergency crew to come chalk the aircraft so I wouldn't roll off the side of the taxiway. The emergency crew showed up, provided chalks, as this one here, so the aircraft would not just roll off the side of the taxiway, because without the brakes there's no other way to stop the aircraft unless it's with a tail hook, but there's no arresting gear in the area. As the rescue crew chalked the aircraft, the fire started. The residual heat from the abrupt stop continued to build in the brakes of these very beefy landing gear. There was residual grease and hydraulic fluid behind the brake lining area. That heat was enough to touch off the grease and the hydraulic fluid. The grease and the hydraulic fluid in itself was able to then ignite the tire. The tire exploded, which resulted in rupturing lines around this landing gear, which resulted in release of more hydraulic fluid and resulted in a quite impressive fire. My delight is I didn't do what I intended to do, go back to the beginning of the takeoff area and take off for my flight. If I had done that, all the fire, all that event would have happened up in this wheel well. And so I'm delighted these brakes worked well, and delighted for the crash crew that saved me from taking off.